and welcome everybody. Welcome to, as she said, the third installment of this three-part series. Today we're going to be talking about risk-tolerant classrooms. And the focus of this workshop is going to be really looking at how to create that type of classroom, defining stereotype threats, defining what a risk-tolerant classroom is, strategies to create such a room, and practices to maintain a safe environment. Because many students suffer from what I call educational trauma, and it results from the lack of cultural proficiency of teachers and school staff, and it hinders their learning and experience in the classroom. So I want us to have this brief discussion about how a culture can be created within schools that supports an open learning environment for both the teacher and the student to really freely engage in inquiry, critical thinking, and making and exploring mistakes. And so this workshop is going to offer some practical strategies for creating a classroom where academic and social emotional goals are accomplished side by side with implementing culturally responsive instruction and a little bit of anti-bias values. So who is this lady talking here? Tara introduced me, but a little more about me. I'm a life coach and I'm a trainer with a focus on social emotional interventions in corporate and educational settings. I taught at York College for 15 years in the psychology department. In the behavioral sciences department, I taught psychology, and I was able to create personal growth courses there, and for many years teach Black psychology. And I taught that to a population that was largely products of the New York City school system and mostly minority students. And they were me. I too am a product of the New York City school system. I actually taught at my undergrad alma mater, and my daughter as well was a part of that school system. My mother bussed me out after the third grade to a largely white district to help desegregate it. And I did the same thing to my daughter, sent her to the same school district that was only 14% Black, some almost 30 years later. And it was a traumatic experience for both of us. We both had a difficult time. And then my daughter went on to a PWI, primarily white institution for college, which was a further alienating experience for her. So, what I know is that students shouldn't have to survive school, right? And reversing the educational trauma of implicit bias shouldn't be an added responsibility of any parent. So we're hoping that this conversation helps mitigate that for at least the children that you touch. So here's our agenda for today that I didn't add in. We're going to examine the impact of some traditional classroom practices and the effect that they can have on minority students. We're going to discuss how to bring inclusiveness to the teacher, classroom, and ethos. And, we're going to look at some practical strategies that will really help to incorporate the classroom into a place that's safe, feels safe for minority students. So the first thing we're going to talk about is stereotype threats. And Black students, they have to contend with two sources of stress rather than one, because they have the fear of confirming common biases. And that's pretty much what stereotype threats are. So stereotype threats arise when there's a fear amongst members of a group of reinforcing negative stereotypes about the intellectual ability of the group. And studies indicate that African-American teenagers are aware they are stigmatized as being intellectually inferior, and that they go to school bearing what psychologist Claude Steele has called a burden of suspicion. And that burden can really affect their attitudes and their achievements. So here's the thing. Students already know what society thinks of them, right? They have TV, social media, they have their families, they have experiences comments that they overhear, and your approaches will tell them what you think of them. And then this will create even greater pressure on them. So even if it's subtle, sometimes these children are constantly analyzing how you feel about them. So they have pressure. Sometimes they already get it from home. You got to work 2 times as hard. How many people, raise your hand, use a little thing and raise your hand if you've been told you have to work 2 times as hard to get the same credit as the other students? I see some thumbs raised there. Right. You're working 2 times as hard, getting half the credit. You have to dress better so that people take you seriously. You know, I know we used to, if my family went to a hotel, we tried to clean the hotel room before the maid came in because we didn't want the maid to think that we were dirty and sloppy like the narrative was. Anybody else have experiences like that? Where you're doing the work before you go to the people so that, you know, they won't think bad about you? Right. I see some thumbs up. So these kids, they're getting these messages. They're having certain experiences. My daughter in junior high school had a classmate who was of the majority, who didn't do the work. We went to the teacher ahead of time. She told the teacher ahead of time that she didn't do the work. She did all the work for this group project. And, you know, there was no consequence for the little girl. And so it became a talk with my daughter about how sometimes people have biases and it allows them to excuse certain behaviors. But please don't think that you'll be able to get away with the same behavior. We're not even going to test the theory, right? So children are having these conversations at home. They're seeing how the television portrays them. They're seeing on social media. Nowadays, these kids are more informed than we ever were, even if you're young. 10 years ago, the access to information and what's being put in front of you is so much different. So from that, there's a fear. They have a fear of reinforcing the negative stereotypes. And so the stereotypes may help us navigate the world. Stereotypes can help us, right? Because it helps our processing. That's one of the reasons that our mind creates them, so that we can have go-tos and don't have to process information, you know, and take all the time, right? So they help us navigate the world, but they can also force the affected to live up to or down to the description. And that can be good or bad, depending on how you hold them. So discrimination also doesn't have to involve overt acts of hatred, but it can be as simple as just maintaining the status quo. You're not trying to change anything. You're just going along with what happens regardless, right? And so some students may perform below their potential because of the stress of being under constant evaluation in the classroom. Black students, however, they experience that same stress, and they'll have another source of stress in addition to their peers. And it is specific to negatively stereotyped groups. So because of this, Black children often contend with, and other minorities as well, often contend with 2 sources of stress rather than 1. Their performance might be suppressed relative to that of their non-minority peers. And this general one, that they have this additional stress that they share with their non-minority peers. So a lot of times it's really hard for them to really step up or feel safe in a classroom because they constantly feel like they're being judged and that they can't prove the instructor or the majority right. And so these shadows hang over stigmatized people no matter their status or accomplishment. It goes outside of the classroom and being a student, and oftentimes follows people into their careers, which is something that you all should address with your students too. If you can help them at this part, particularly with these curriculums that you all have that are career-based, it should be a part that plays in them being able to safely navigate through in their professional life, right? They must remain on guard. Oftentimes, Minorities at every level, school professionally, feel like they must remain on guard and bear an additional burden that might affect their self-confidence, it might affect their performance and their aspirations. And these stigmas have the potential to rob them of their individuality. They're scared to be self-expressed, to show who they are, to talk about the ideas they have, and it will debilitate attempts to break out of stereotypical roles. So basically, just kind of stay in your lane. And what is the world losing out on aside from the student if that's the approach that's taken? That adversity is going to really affect their psychology, and it has consequences on their learning. So while everybody's looking at how to tackle large-scale problems in the educational system, I think we need to really worry about helping these students directly to become more motivated and successful learners. And we, in order to do that, have to become more aware of non-cognitive factors. The little things that we do in the classroom that make a big difference in our students' learning, either positively or negatively. And one consequence I'd like to add of negative stereotypes is to cause people to wonder whether they will be fully included and valued in the academic environment they're in, or even in a professional environment. And anybody, if you have anyone that may wonder if they're going to be able to get along with people and new students, like a transfer student, that can negatively impact their work because they're so worried about the social aspect and the social emotional aspect of belonging that it affects their ability to focus on their work. All right, feelings of loneliness, fear of being criticized from an instructor, all of that stuff becomes evidence that they don't belong in the school in general. And then it undermines their motivation. In terms of your environment and what impact you think you can have, because we all can have impact if only within our rooms. I know, when I was teaching, I spent a lot of time trying to reverse a lot of the narratives that the students were taught and that they had adopted. And so my impact was pretty great just from the students I was able to touch in my classroom. And there's a ripple effect too, right? So I don't want anybody to think that just because they don't have teams under them, that there's not a possibility for them to create change. And you get to talk, you get to coach up and start talking to the people who are your supervisors about what's possible. So, really, I encourage you to really think about these questions and what you would like to see happen. I think because, we have a white normative centered culture that a lot of people think that if they're doing things that would feel good or make white folks feel like they belong, then it will work for children of other cultures and other races, because you can be a different race and have a different culture, right? Every race doesn't have the same culture. So that has to be distinguished. And so people, educators and administrators really need to look at what they're creating and if it in fact is having the intended impact. And I can't stress enough, we talked about it then, we'll talk about it again, talking to the students. Because you think you're doing something great. Ooh, this is reaching the world. I'm changing things. And the students over there like, yeah, not so much. All right. Oh boy, here we go again with this foolishness. And then they go home and the impact sometimes is actually quite the opposite of what you intended, because they feel even less seen when you told them that you had something that was going to create some kind of unity and safe space and acknowledge them. And then they realize that all of this is based off of, an outsider's perspective, if you will. So guess what? It makes your job so much easier. All right. While you're sitting here racking your brain trying to figure out how to reach these kids, how to touch, move, inspire them, how to enroll them in the possibilities of how to open the class up to be more inclusive. And then you have, experts, if you will, sitting right there, and we're not taking advantage of the resource. So, I stress it a lot. Bring the and we're going to stress it again, to bring the children, bring your students into your lesson planning. It's very insightful and considerate of you to do that. And a lot of educators aren't that considerate, insightful, or they don't want to put in the effort. Like, some are going to do the same lesson plan they've been doing since 1976, right? And they're never going to look at what's changed. They're not going to create new examples. Those examples are powerful to them, and they will continue to use them while they have no concern about the impact they have on the classroom or on the students. So what you're doing is amazing, and it is actually part of a model to ensure that the children do feel that they belong and that they're valued, and that what they have to say and how they feel matters, right? So to keep children from feeling the threats, there are a few ways to deal with them. And one way of dealing with stereotype threats is by setting up a culturally responsive classroom, which we talked about in session 2, and a risk-tolerant classroom, which we will talk more about today. And it's just not surprising that an important predictor of academic success is feelings of social belonging in schools, as well as the perception of the quality of their relationships with other students and teachers. When students feel like they belong, it has a direct impact on their success in the classroom. And you can predict pretty much how successful they'll be based on how much they feel like they belong and have good relationships with other people in the school, particularly their teacher. An important factor in determining whether students stay engaged and achieve in school is their sense of belonging, right? Do they feel respected? Do they feel included? And basically, while, all of us have biases, we talked about that in session 1, and you might not understand your biases or be able to change them immediately, because that takes a while. You can start to look and see where your actions, what kind of impact they're having, right? And start to really analyze what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. So that takes a while sometimes. So that you can't do instantly, but what you can do immediately is set up your classroom and give assignments to mitigate your biases and create a space that the minority children can feel secure in. I have colleagues their mission is to eradicate racism in the classroom. And to me, that just seems unreasonable. Like, racism and biases are going to exist. Every human has some kind of bias. Even if it's not a racist one with a big R, we still have racist ones with little R's. And my whole thing is, while you might, to not have biases is unreasonable, but to be able to set up a room and watch what you're offering the children so that you are not giving them anything that perpetuates the bias, that we can look into and that we can control, right? And sometimes that might require having other people look at what you've decided so that they can see if there's still some of, your biases sneaking in, and also talking to the children. So addressing the psychology of the student is really critical, and it can galvanize students to seize opportunities for learning that exist, right? Also helps to reduce the stress and worry about the stereotype threats, and that can boost academic performance when you don't feel like you're being judged. So, how do social psychological interventions change student psychology and improve their academic outcome in the short term? What they do is they target children's experiences schools from the child's perspective, and then they use impactful delivery mechanisms. So you find out what it is the child thinks and needs, and then you create mechanisms, much like Ariane said, to help them and propel them through the school experience, right? You have to target kids' subjective experience in school. You have to find out what their experience is. A few other things about a risk-tolerant classroom. It supports inquiry and critical thinking, and it allows students to really explore their mistakes, find solutions, and iterate on those solutions, all in an open learning environment. You leave room for it. It reinforces that intelligence is expandable and could grow when they work. That's cultivating a growth mindset, right? Highlights the values of mistakes in service to learning, right? Putting kids in charge of their own learning. We talked about that a little. Let me expand the screen a little bit. Put the kids in charge of their own learning. Teach them that their difficulty is just a part of normal learning and adjustment rather than something that's unique to them or their racial group. Because while, minorities do have their own types of stereotype threats, kids in all age groups have something that they're worried about, right? So our kids are not alone. It might be a unique type of concern, but they're not unique in that they have concerns around belonging. So, these are some strategies that you can use in context of, risk tolerant classrooms and in context of stereotype threats. So what if when the kid fails, here's a question for you. What if, when the child fails, do we make it okay? Or do we get on their case? Or do we make generalizations about them? Because in a business world, I'm an entrepreneur, failure means that we understand failure is inevitable, right? And it's just like a part of success. You just keep plugging away at your goal. But in the school world, oftentimes educators make students feel like their mistakes are like some indicative of their intellect and what's possible for them. And really, education should be about embracing the mistakes and letting the kids know that it leads to success. And I think science teachers probably understand this concept better than most teachers, right? We have any science teachers in here? I don't know. I can't see everybody. But if we do, they'll let you know that they call mistakes hypothesis, and they refer to that process as an experiment. It's not a success or it's not a failure, right? And imagine if we really embrace that, teaching students that you can learn from your failures. There's a book, I forget who it's by, I want to say John Maxwell, called Failing Forward, right? What if we really made them feel like that this is just part of forward motion is actually the key to success? There's a lot of times when kids get something wrong, particularly how we're grading, it makes them feel like, it shuts them down and speaks to failure as opposed to a process going to success. And so a lot of the kids feel vulnerable in school, and then school just becomes a place where they're tested and judged. And that often happens publicly. And then they feel inadequate. Teachers are a little more careful now around that, but oftentimes, people were made examples of, or, ostracized in many ways for not being prepared and getting the work right, as opposed to looking at what needs to occur to ensure that these children are able to absorb this information and learn it. Application is the evidence of learning, right? So will they be able to apply this information? And if not, what do we do? And how are we making them feel about it? Particularly minority students who already think that they're dumb. The rubric can feel subjective as well. It does help. It sets ground rules, but this kid did it the same way I did, and they received this much credit. So why didn't I? Or in their course of learning, they were given more time to explore getting it right. And you rushed me and called on somebody else and didn't give me a chance to work through this issue. So it can show up even when there's this, when they know the grading, it can still show up at the interactions in the process of learning that you don't feel the same about me. Here's the thing. Most students don't object to the difficulty of a problem itself. It's the risk of embarrassment and feeling stupid that make them want to avoid the challenge. So in our work, we interviewed a bunch of students and surveyed hundreds and found out that this is a similar concern. I don't mind trying, but I don't want to look dumb. And if teachers don't give the opportunity and help work with them and respond when they do have an answer that doesn't work or is incorrect, then that will stop children from trying. And it's been shown. So here's the thing about risk-tolerant classrooms. They should highlight the value of mistakes in the service of learning. You know, I always say, this is my acronym for FAIL, first attempts in learning. And I feel like that's how classrooms should be approached. It should always be looked at, if you fail, it's just another attempt at learning. It's just your first attempts. If the student feels that a bad grade means that she needs more time to learn, then they might redouble their efforts and perform better over time. So it's possible to change students' attributes so that they see poor grades as a result of a temporary and not permanent cause. What I used to tell my students is that this grade is not a reflection on you, it's a reflection on your aptitude around this information. It's a reflection of your, it might be a reflection of your effort, but it's not a reflection of you and who you are and what's possible and how smart you are and how well you can grasp this information. All it does is tell you what's going on with you now in relationship to this information. That's in relationship to this, this task. That's it. Because you can see it. You can see it on kids' faces when they make up a story about themselves based on the grade. You can see it in their physiological. Some of them, I've seen them boil up their tests and throw them, or you see them, you know, do this, and it's like the grade is confirmation on what they're not and what's not possible. So we really have to work at making sure they understand that it's just an attempt at learning. It's not anything symbolic of what's possible for you. Because we don't want them to avoid challenges. We want them to approach their challenges with high expectations and leave room for failing. And a big way of doing that is to model it yourself and to own up to your own failures. And that will make them feel safer and be more involved. I'm clear when I mess up, and I'm clear to let them know I messed up and apologize too. Like, be open to saying you're sorry about things that you did that didn't land the way you wanted to, or being unprepared. We know we've gone into that classroom sometime and we have not been prepared for either the day or for what came up in that moment. And we get to say that, wow, like, I'm really not equipped for this, or I wasn't ready for this, or I didn't prepare well. And that lets students know, because you're a model of possibility, right? You graduated from school, you have a good job, this and that. We're models of possibility for students, even if we're not the same race, and particularly if we are the same race or the same culture. So when you let them know that you messed up, that you failed, that you forgot something, that you don't know something, that leaves space for them to know that things are possible for them, even if they're not perfect, even if they don't get it right, and that you can fail and keep it pushing, as we say. That's something me and my friends always say, keep it pushing, right? That's a colloquialism. But, you know, I keep that in my head oftentimes when I'm down, like, yo, keep it pushing. Because a lot of them didn't write well. And so I intentionally gave writing assignments, and I talk about it all the time, that I was encouraged not to be concerned with how well they wrote, as long as I saw that they conceptually had the idea right, which was cockeyed to me. And you know, and that goes to that low expectation that you have. And so you actually buy into it and try to get them to buy into it. So I gave a lot of writing assignments, and I gave assignments where they couldn't plagiarize, right? We'll talk more about autobiographical assignments, which I always encourage in some capacity, or I would have them in my Black Psych class, I would have them watch Crash and watch Do the Right Thing. And then they had to write about the movies within the, you know, parameters that I gave them. So they couldn't cheat, right? So they had to write. And then always, I tell her, if your grade is below a D, you have an opportunity to write the paper over. And there's extensive feedback given within the paper, and there's general feedback on my cover, because I had a certain cover where they had to leave room for comments. And, you know, sometimes I gave them 3 times to write it over, which I told them is really cutting into my social life because I'm single. You know, I should be outside giggling and schmiggling, but I'm going to reserve these weekends for you all. And, you know, most appreciate and make the, you know, take advantage of the opportunity because they realize that you're enrolled in them being able to, you know, even if they don't have mastery, they'll have a better grasp of what's required. They know you care. I had a student once laugh when I gave him his paper back, and I said, "What are you laughing at?" He said, "You actually read the papers." And I was like, "Yeah, of course I do." He's like, "Most of the professors don't." So if they feel like you're not even reading the papers, what kind of value are you giving to their work? Right? So, you know, what you said is important. It's a journey. The grade is part of a journey and a conversation. I'm actually going to steal that. And, you know, it's not the final destination. And that leaves space for the students, right? That leaves space for them to do more. They'll stretch beyond their comfort zones when they're introduced to new topics or assignments if they know that there'll be a room for them to grow and it's not a judgment. And much like you said, you know, a lot of kids do find the instruction confusing, and that leads to error. But what if teachers took the time to just ask people to tell them, what did you hear? What did you hear? What do you think I'm asking you all to do? Like, easy. And then if they need some help, that's another conversation. Learning both ways, right? And another opportunity to say, I failed. I'm sorry, you all. I did not get that right clearly because there's so much confusion here around what these instructions are. Clearly, I failed at being able to give clear instruction. So let's try this again. Tell me what you need. I'm going to write it out and I'll make a note. Thank you. How much space that leaves. And another thing to do is you can point out the interesting, varied ways that people approach the same problem and have the students discuss how they were thinking and how they approached it. So people can know that just because you don't do it one way doesn't mean that what you have to offer in the way that you're doing it is not good and it doesn't work. Because if people get caught up trying to do things one way, and if they don't do it the right way and the only way, then they're not doing it appropriately. That keeps people, it discourages people from being, being independent thinkers and to be able to take risks and to be willing to explore what's possible. And then you get to do that too. And we talked about humor. Humor came up earlier. You know, humor can fit in here well. You know, you can make a little joke about yourself. Can't make jokes about the kids. You can make a joke about yourself here to let them know that, you know, it's just not that serious if you make a mistake in your schoolwork, right? I knew a growth mindset teacher who kept a big pink eraser on her desk labeled for the big mistakes, right? So she can let them know she's prepared for these mistakes and she knows she's gonna make a lot of them. That's why I need this big eraser. So what essentially happens is you're gonna praise the process, right? Not the person. And that's important. And so a few of the things that we said here and some others that really help create a safe environment and context to stereotype threats is really connecting with the students, find out, you know, let them know their relevancy and establish an emotionally safe zone, right? Where they can talk about their lives, where you can ask them questions about their lives and their hobbies, let them know that what they do matters and that you care about them and that you're trying to relate to them. have brief affirmation writing exercises. That helps to help negatively stereotype students perform better on academic tests. And, herald when they have their successes. So I have a cousin who had her first child at 16, and by the time she was 21, she had not 21, about 25. She had five children. She dropped out of high school. She stayed home and she raised these kids. And when her youngest was in school, she decided she would go get a job. And she was a great parent. She is a great parent. And so she decided to be a home health attendant. And she took a course, and then she took the exam at the end, and she got the highest grade in the class. And she said she was telling me there were people in there who had college degrees, people who had these careers, and she had the highest grade. And she said to me, that's the first time in my life I realized I wasn't stupid. And she was in her 30s by then. In her 30s. And so she dropped out of school at 16. And it was relatively easy for her. What messages was she getting? What messages? And then after she realized she wasn't stupid, she went and got a GED, and then she went and got her degree in nursing. Now she's a registered nurse. And she did that all in the course of a few years. When we can give these kids a message about who they are and stop continuing to give them a message about who they're not, it changes their lives. It changes their lives. I had a student, was a freshman, and I pulled her aside because I was watching the inconsistency. And back then, I used to have classes with 135 students. She sat up front, and I used to watch my students just to see how they responded, even when you gave a paper back. And I asked her one day, like, what's going on with you? You're inconsistent, this, that, and the other, and you're a smart girl. Like, I see this, I see that. She started crying. I was like, uh-oh, what did I do? What'd I do? And I was like, what's wrong? She said, nobody ever told me that before. 19 years old, in college. Nobody ever told her she was smart and had the capacity. So she was approaching the work with ambivalence because there was nothing that suggested to her that she could really be successful at college. We don't want to be the people who keep perpetuating these messages. It's very important that we look at what kind of classrooms we're creating and our messages. And in the first two parts of this series, I talked a lot about the message in terms of what's coming out of your mouth. This message is really a message around what kind of environment how the classroom speaks, and what kind of environment you create in the classroom. Because sometimes the classroom environment and the culture that you create in your classroom speaks to failure. Or at the very least, it doesn't encourage these students to see that their uniqueness is not something that will disempowering or something that's going to have a negative impact on their abilities, but it's actually the thing that's going to be what helps propel them. Their uniqueness is actually a strength and a weapon for greatness. I think it must have happened to me a lot when I was younger, because I get so upset when people try to explain concepts to me. I know, like, I went to the doctor and they say, I'm just going to use something. I didn't have this. You have an aneurysm. That is, and I'm like, I know what that means, right? And I find that I do that a lot. And I wonder if somewhere along the line, in my youth, if there were a lot of assumptions made about what I didn't know and how people handled me, because it's really a pet peeve of mine. And how are these strangers supposed to know what I know? But and it happens to the children. And it's very important. When I was younger, if you came from another country, you automatically got left back a year. They didn't give you a test or anything. They just assumed that you didn't know enough to be in your proper grade. That's changed now, but I still think, like you said, it's kind of held in the back of people's heads. They can't speak English. They probably don't know anything. They came from there. They're probably behind. And some of those other countries have their education system is far more advanced than ours. Some of these kids got to come out of there years ahead of us. And we're over here talking to them slowly, right? Instead of assuming that they might know or asking them what they know. So, also we need to, when we find out that they have some kind of negative stereotype that they believe about themselves, we have to look into doing the work to make sure that we turn that around and we correct it, right? It's good to know what the kids think about each other and what they think is possible for them. And one of the exercises I think is good for students, and to find out where their possibilities are and what they think about themselves, and to help them become enrolled in the possibilities, is to have them do a come as you want to be party. Like, have them dress as what it is they aspire to be. That'll give you a little insight into what they think about themselves, right? And then you can have them write about and research that. And I saw this occur in our child services department here with some foster children who had been incarcerated, and they were all boys, and they spent a whole summer researching the topics and then meeting with people who had and did what they wanted to do so that they could see the possibilities, right? And then it's up to us to support that. I used to bring in people who were from my community and of the cultures and races of my students who had excelled in life, to talk to them. Elected officials, people who ran, one of the young lady was 29 who had helped put together the Million Woman March, is a Queens girl, right? Tyrona knows her, she's the Natasha Williams. Coming there at 28, 29 years old, and you helped create one of the biggest movements there were. Electeds who came from the neighborhood, came from single parent household, came from immigrant households, came from domestic abuse households, were raised by people other than their parents. The elevator operator who's now the head of the Teamsters, all of these stories, because I needed to, create an environment where they saw the possibilities, right? So you can have them do assignments, you can have them dress the part, research the part, you can bring in people to talk to the possibilities. All of this helps them understand and tell their story. Don't tell about how successful you are, tell what it took to get here. It's like if you watch any of these shows, a biographical show, they always get to that part where they go, and then tragedy struck, right? Because everybody has it in their life. Nobody just floats on up to, good times. And for these students to hear that reinforces that there's going to be failure, there's going to be things that happen, and you still can create and become something amazing and reach your goals. It just might include the failure, and that's okay. So you can link courses to link course outcomes to future careers. Have them do things that link to future careers. You can design assignments to address work-related issues. And you can demonstrate how professionals would use your course material too. So that will help them in terms of, career and seeing what's possible for them. Now, the thing to watch out for here is these action steps are where most what I call linguistic lynchings take place by educators. And that can happen by word, gesture, or spirit, where you kill the dream, right? And it can be a head tilt. I want to be a pilot. Okay, great. Go do the research, right? They saw it. Well, maybe you should try for something that's a little less ambitious. We have to watch our linguistic lynchings. We have to watch what we're saying to these kids when they tell you what they aspire to. That's the tricky part. And we have to watch what we do, because sometimes our disbelief shows through. And then how does that translate, right? You want to make sure you're always targeting their beliefs about their future self. Always, always. And Also, I want to talk about affirming important values to students. Self-affirmation theory proposes that reminding people of diverse positive aspects of themselves can lead people to see negative events and information as less threatening and reduce distress, and thus help them function more efficiently. So this can really, really buffer negative stereotype threats and assumptions if you help the children really to shore up their sense of self. And so you can ask them to write about their values that are personally important to them. And in science, there's been studies that show that when you give assignments that relate to what's going on in their home, that it helps them understand the science and do better and feel better about the possibilities in that area. As we know, a lot of minority students are not excelling in the STEM areas. And a lot of times it's because what you're offering them they can't relate to it. And that came up a little earlier. So try to make assignments that they can do in their homes that will relate to their experiences at home and outside of the classroom, right? And then you can also even incorporate brief value affirming writing exercises that can help negate the stereotypes they have about themselves. So, and that can happen even within a science exercise, within anything. I don't care if it's gym, you can find a way to incorporate some kind of affirming values and exercises to do that. I had a friend that was really, really sick recently, and they kept knocking themselves, but we were like, you were in a wheelchair, now you can walk up a flight of steps. You need to celebrate that. That's what we need to do in the classroom. I see you doing 2 push-ups now. Everybody else doing 30. You're doing 2. Look at the progress you're making. Tell me what it was that you used within yourself to get you to do that extra one. What did you have to say to yourself? That didn't make you give up, even though everybody else has moved on? What are you using? Because that's amazing. I see you. I see you trying. That's what it looks like half the time. It's just an acknowledgement of the effort and what's possible. And as what came up before, if some kid is not doing well, you can ask them why. What's going on here? And they might tell you something. My mother won't allow me to, I don't have a tablet at home. I don't have the internet. I can't do this. I didn't have the ingredients necessary to create this project or do it, In my house, if we do something like that, it's considered whatever is considered, but a negative thing. I can't do that. Then you get to regroup. In one of several, an exercise you could do is have the children do 15 to 20-minute sessions beginning at the beginning of the school year, where they write 1 or 2 or 3 values that were important to them within their classroom writing assignments. And there was an experiment done with this, and the students that wrote about the values, they did better throughout the next 2 academic years than students that weren't told to write about their values and look at their values. That tethers students sometimes. Think about what keeps you excelling and being in a commitment to doing better with your students. What you even on this is because you have certain values, and so they tether you and they direct you to take certain actions. If you make the students understand their values and find ways to reinforce them within their exercises, they will be tethered to them and they will propel them to move forward. It's just like with my little cousin, when she found out she was smarter. It opened her up to understanding different things that she valued, and it moved her and propelled her forward. And they'll think it's corny sometimes. I used to have my students do value affirming activities and write out this and that, and they'd be like, oh, this is so corny. But guess what? Later, as I incorporated them not so blatantly into assignments, you saw changes and shifts and how they showed up, because there's a new thing playing around in their head. And you can remind them of them too. I thought you said one of your values was, Is that reflected in how you're showing up? How can it be reflected? Classroom reflective texts coupled with non-judgmental dialogue, super effective. And that's choosing books and texts and assignments that reflect the classroom demographic, and that you can follow up with discussions about what they took out of it, where it aligned with their values, and have them do reflective writings that can provide you with information about them and their hopes and their concerns or their life circumstances or strengths are very powerful tools if you read them. Right. Those practices can open up channels of understanding amongst the students themselves. And successful conversations about issues of identity frequently lead to deeper dialogue about the students and their backgrounds and their experiences with others. And then you get to recreate some of your curriculum or your approaches when you have this information in a non-judgmental way. And when the students realize that they're accepted and what they have to offer and their lives and their cultures are accepted, it opens them up in a way that they'll be more receptive to what you have to offer them because they know that they're safe in your room. Now, I want to get to nurturing a risk-tolerant peer culture. And that came up a little bit too. You know, peers are powerful agents. And you can't really have a risk-tolerant culture without their cooperation. And that could work the other way too, that kids can tear down a classmate who seems to be striving in class. You know, that whole crabs in a barrel phenomenon. So as an adult, you really need to set the tone and establish clear expectations about how your students are going to treat each other, right? And what are some ways that can be done? That's come up already here a couple of times. So it's nice to know that it's being practiced already. Involve the students in the teaching process. Involve them in giving you feedback about how effective you're being. Let them help each other, right? And for us, you want to never call out or embarrass a student publicly over anything if you can help it. And you want to stop students who want to do that too, right? You also don't want to overpraise students publicly. Don't glow. Everybody got a teacher's pet. Everybody has a favorite, period. Just like you have a favorite child if you have more than one. And people like to say, I don't have a favorite child. I love them all the same. And it's just not true. There's always one that you relate to, you understand more. But it's important that the other children don't feel that way. So, you know, it's as bad to overpraise a child as it is to embarrass a child. So, and if you're going to praise them, don't praise them for their attributes. Right. Oh my God, you did such a good job. You're such a natural. You always finish your work so quickly. You know, you're such an excellent student. You always finish your work so quickly. No. You know, I see how hard you're working at this. And it's showing up in your results if you have to bring somebody forward. And imagine when the child who is not able to be successful at their attempts, but we talk about the process and realize what their process is, commend them for trying, and then work with them on creating a different process. That message to the class. And when you teach your students to do that, if you have a way of doing this work, does anybody have any insight how we can help Johnny learn how to solve this question or this problem or how to approach this writing? How did you do this? When I was in grad school, I was struggling. And I made up a narrative about myself, which thank God I had a mentor who set me straight on the amount of responsibilities I had and how that might be affecting me. But there was another thing. I didn't know how to study. And so I missed the test once because my daughter had to have hernia surgery. I swear God scheduled that surgery that day just for me. And so when I came back to class and they were reviewing the exam, I sat next to a guy who had a 97 on the exam, and it was essay. And I asked him if I could look at his test, because that's the kind of person I am, right? Can I see your test? He was like, sure. And I read through his exam, and then when the teacher reviewed it, it was like it was verbatim. And I was like, how did you do that? Because, you know, I'm taking all these classes, you're reading all these chapters. How did you manage to narrow this down so perfectly? He was like, well, and he gave me his little strategy. And a big part of it was rewriting his notes in outline form, you know, very short questions. But he also was like, I don't really read the book. I realize that most of these professors just want you to regurgitate what they're telling you. I only use the book if I need to supplement or don't understand the concept. And then I write my notes out in outline form. It changed my whole life. So imagine if we gave students opportunities to, you seem to do well in this area. Can you tell us your process? How is it that you manage to do this work and do it so well? Right? So what we're focusing on is not the person, but the process, and we allow them to teach the children. This is a peer. So it's easier sometimes when we tell them something, and as been noted, we don't even get it right half the time, but these kids understand each other's language. And so they can talk to them and they can help each other. And what kind of community do you create there, right? And it's up to us to ask students to reflect on how they feel and to let them know that they could create a culture together, that it's not even just you, but they can create a culture that will support all the students by doing that same thing for the other people in the class. You model empathy, generally people will give what they get. You model empathy, they'll start modeling empathy. You become curious about people, they'll become curious about people. You celebrate the diversity and the differences, they'll start to celebrate it. Right? So it's very important to nurture a peer tolerant, a risk tolerant peer culture. And also, you know, never compare kids with regard to their aptitude or talents. And sometimes this one can be hard, but when one of the kids in the classroom or in the family, right, is the smart one or the athletic one, that child may limit themselves to just that pursuit, because this is the thing that you told them they're good at. And it might set other kids up to feel like they'll never be that, so why even try? So you want to try to get rid of that fear of measuring up in the classroom. Oftentimes it affects the kid because they're going to, if this is the only way I can shine, this is how I'm going to shine. You know, I know adults to this day that were told they were the smart child. You're so smart, that's what you have. And it stifled them in so many ways, right? Number one, they always feel like they have to show up as the smart one or they have no value. And number two, they don't see the things about themselves, the other things about themselves that are so valuable. And so they might not even work on them. They might not work on their personality. They might not work on their emotional intelligence. None of that stuff is important. What's important is that I'm smart. So now you're smart and you stink and you're funky and you know, you got an attitude problem because nobody ever told you needed to work on that. This is where you're going to excel. Or you have these other talents and things about you that work so well, but you will never, ever actualize them or become fully actualized because you're focusing on this one thing that makes you special. And then other kids will stop doing it in the class and in the home. They'll stop even trying in those areas because what's the use? They already said that's the one that wins, right? So you want to be careful about that. And some of these changes might take time for all of us. And at first, the students might be even resistant to that, especially if they become dependent on easy praise and learn to be comfortable in a low challenging mode, right? And that's a social emotional challenge, and that's a work challenge. If they're comfortable, they're not going to want to change. But if you stick with it, you'll see them start to show more initiative, persistence, and be more supportive of each other. And that will create a growth mindset culture, which generally leads to a risk-tolerant culture, because a growth mindset culture says that failure is just part of the journey. All right? So here are my suggestions. And this came up on our last session. Maria brought this up, the courageous conversations, right? Engage in courageous conversations to transform school practices. And there's a book called Courageous Conversations about race, and it called upon educators to have real, authentic, and hard conversations about race and racism in their classrooms. Have the conversations. And even if it's just one child, if it's not a monolithic classroom, have the conversations. And I might say, even if it's a monolithic classroom, still have the conversations. Particularly at times like this, when race is so much at the forefront, right? You want to have authentic conversations. You want to commit to equity for all students. You want to start practicing what they call anti-racism, where you start to look at ways to engage that are totally the opposite of what's shown up as racist ways. And racism, it's a tricky word that's been used out of context a lot too, because racism is really a verb. It's not a mindset. So people can be prejudiced and bigoted, but racism is actions taken by people who can take their who have the power to use their prejudice to enact some kind of action against somebody else, right? So when people are like, you're racist, most of the time they mean they're prejudiced or they're bigoted, right? Or they're being stereotypical, because racist is an action. So when prejudice and power meet to enact something against somebody. Just had to stick that in there. When I talk about this anti-racism, that's why I kind of said it like I said it, because it's it is one of the phrases of today, but I don't think it's really positioned well. But you can use practices like that to try to change the paradigm and effectively address racial disparities. Because a lot of these children's conversations are based on little to nothing concrete, right? I say employ a so what test, right? When clear behavioral expectations are necessary to create and maintain an environment, that's one thing. But some expectations have more to do with power and control than a student's learning. So when a student's behavior doesn't conform to a certain expectation, a teacher or administrator can ask themselves, so what, right? So what if the students work together on an assignment instead of alone? So what if the student wants to be stand up during some of the work time that he does the work, right? By assessing the potential harm of a behavior, if there's any, a student can direct teaching time and effort at rules that protect and improve the student's education and learning, not so much trying to make them conform to what you think is best. And I talked about that a little with the last session, how Black people are really tribal and communal. And so a lot of times we work together. And so when assignments come up and they want to work together on it or help somebody, oftentimes they'd be chastised, as opposed to understanding that this is the way they've been taught. A lot of cultures live multi-generationally. And so they don't even cook by themselves. Come on in here and help your grandmother with these peas, and come on over here and help do this, or we're all cooking dinner now, or we're all working on this. Come on and help us. So to not help in the school environment seems strange and wrong, or to not be able to receive help, they don't understand it. And so when we understand the cultures and what's the norms, then sometimes we can be a little laxed on how we approach everything and see that it's not really a big deal. And it might actually foster learning as opposed to hinder it, right? Honoring students' experiences. have them explore their personal and social identities. And we have to provide a safe space for students to really feel seen, valued, cared for, and respected. And it's also important that they have the opportunities to learn about one another's varied experiences and perspectives. And if you can kind of create this kind of learning environment, you can skillfully draw on their experiences to enrich the curriculum. When I have my students do autobiographical papers, if I see common themes throughout, it becomes it's woven into my curriculum. It's going to become a conversation. I'm going to, offer what I can to help in support of whatever that thing is that I see keeps coming up. And then the students, it's like when, you talk to somebody and tell them something you like, and when they get you a gift, they get you this thing that you casually mentioned, you feel so seen. That's the gift that you give your students, that when they casually mention something and then you incorporate it and speak to it or speak to their abilities, that's a gift. And they know that you've been listening and you value them and you value what they need and they want. Right? Teachers that can show they relate to students' lives and their identities in a variety of ways, it really helps the children want to invest more time, because they realize you're investing more time into them. So they want to invest more time into you. Oftentimes when your students see how much you care about them, they do not want to disappoint you. They want to do the work because they know that you've already understand what's possible for them, and they want to prove you right. I had a student once not do well on an exam. He didn't fail, but he didn't do well. And he came and apologized to me. And he said, I will never give you another grade like that. Because I kept speaking to his possibility so much, he felt like he needed to apologize for me to not rising up to the level that he knew I believed he possessed. And I'm not saying you want your students apologizing, but wouldn't it be nice if they realize you believe in them so much that they don't want to disappoint you because they know that you're onto something? Like, she said I can do it, so let me do it. Right? So build your curriculums around their personal narratives. Make sure that even when you're doing that you integrate messages about what's possible and how you see them, and show them examples of it in real life. And a lot of that can happen with the autobiographical assignments. If you find some way to make students talk about themselves, if you incorporate that into other lessons, it's going to have huge impact. We talked about affirming valuable, important values. We talked about targeting their beliefs about their future self. Find out what they think of themselves. Find out what they want that they don't think is possible for them. Help them figure out how to do it. Show them examples of it. Make them find examples of it. Make sure that the work that you give out to students also speaks to what's possible. That shows them stories of people who have, come from where they are and have similar backgrounds and have created different things. I used to make my students when I taught leadership, power, and motivation, I had them write a paper on an American business person that, they believed in, how their value systems and the work that they did and the success that they had. And I had a student write about Suge Knight. Now, if none of y'all know who Suge Knight is, he had a rap record empire. He's in jail now, right? But she saw different things about the way he built his business, and that was pre-jail. It was in the thrones of his success. But, I looked at it kind of cockeyed to me, but I had to be in the inquiry and curious about why she picked Suge Knight. You got all these people in the world, Suge Knight, and it was a girl too. But we had a discussion, and she wrote an amazing paper on all of the aspects of his values and his work ethic and all of that she admired. Now, I found who she picked questionable, but she definitely picked out some strong attributes and some strong strategies that he used. So there was value in that. We have to meet them where they are. And then I could work on her beliefs based on what would Suge Knight do. Right? You have to meet them where they are. Don't tell them to pick somebody better. Have them teach you why that's a good example. And then you could talk about the things that didn't work, right? Communication of high expectations. We've been talking about that. There can be consistent methods from both the teacher and from the school that students can succeed based on the genuine respect for the student and belief in their capacity and their capability. And that can happen within the assignments you give them too. Call them up higher. Active teaching methods. Instruction is designed to promote student engagement by requiring that the student play an active role in crafting the curriculum and developing learning activities. And we had great examples of that with Ariane, right? And basically just be their facilitator. You have an active teaching environment. Your role should be guide, mediator, and knowledgeable consultant, as well as the instructor. You don't have to teach the class all the time. Teach the students how to teach each other. Teach the students how to hold each other accountable. Teach the students how to nurture each other. Teach them team, teach them group, teach them the strength of diversity and diverse opinions. And all of that will help create safe environments where students who think that people are already decided what's not possible for them get to feel like they're finally in an environment that appreciates and affirms them and knows what's possible. And that will shift them long after they leave their classroom. So any thoughts in these last few minutes? I always like to do a what's now and what are you going to do now? We have achievement gaps, we have access gaps, opportunity gaps, equality gaps, and expectation gaps. And those gaps are all about us. So what are we going to do to close them? I'm reading a book now, Full Engagement. It talks about the power of energy management. Learning to manage your energy is more important than managing your time, right? So, is it around that? Making sure that you have full emotional energy when you do your work, that you're not tired, that you're eating right, that you're sleeping. What are your secrets to being able to ensure this? How can you support me in helping the rest of the team? When I was in a classroom, I always dressed up. And I used to tell the students I did it out of respect for them, because I know when I go places where I'm worried about my perception and trying to impress people, I always look good. So what did I think of them? If I was willing to come in there all sleppy looking with jeans and whatever, I would never wear wrinkled clothes, but I seen it. I'm like your grandfather. What are you saying about how much these kids matter to you? And even if a day I had ankle surgery and I had to go in there, I used to apologize to them because I had on, a flat boot or whatever. And I was like, I'm really sorry I had to come in here like this, but it's because I'm injured. Like, I want to show up. And I think for students to see that too, because some people don't see people who show up a certain way, it also gives them something to aspire to. But also to what you were saying, and I know this is a heavy lift and a big thing, there are opportunities to get dressed for success or 100 ties, people to come to the school and give the kids clothes too. So that could be a what now, that you look into what resources are available to donate clothes to kids that can't afford them. Right. There's next levels of that. When I see these principals who bring in washing machines into the schools because the kids' clothes are dirty and they don't have the money and the time, now these are, huge ideas, but there are steps to take if you want to implement something to ensure that all of your kids have business attire, and your local officials are a good place to start. because they love to get people to donate clothes and say they did something. It's a win-win. And I implore you all to think like that, like think even bigger about what you can create in your classroom by creating things outside of your classroom and outside of your building. What relationships can you develop so that you can have access to their resources? What organizations can you partner with so they can help bring some things that you need into your classroom? I have to wrap. There's only a minute. I know Tarawana has to close. I thank you all for taking this time with me. I never show my email address or anything. I noticed that the other day, but it's always in the handouts. But if you want to contact me for any reason, I'd love the conversations and any opportunities that you have. And for everybody who hung out with me for all three, you get a special thank you. I appreciate it. And I hope it's been a fruitful experience for you all.